She was 23 and ruined. No room, no wages, no clean name, just a scorched canvas satchel and $4 in coins she had gathered from laundromat floors. And with that $4, she bought a forgotten fluting iron foundry beyond Geneva in Kane County, Illinois, a place that had fallen off county maps in 1948. The north wall leaned 6 inches. Rain entered through the furnace roof. Kane County condemned it on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for the first thaw of spring. But beneath a 20-pound grooved iron base, sealed inside a welded chamber, unopened for 76 years, waited money patents, and a letter written for someone exactly like her. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Fern Ada Hollis had been salvaging her whole life without knowing it. As a child in Aurora, she rescued bent hairpins from gutters, buttons from church basement floors, and ribbon ends from her mother's sewing basket. Her school shoes were repaired twice, then cut down into garden slippers. Even at 9, she distrusted anything thrown away too quickly. Her mother, Lorna, measured safety by appearances. She pressed collars before answering the door and hid overdue notices beneath the silverware tray. When Fern brought home a cracked cup, Lorna said, "People notice damage before they notice care," and discarded it after midnight. The person who taught Fern otherwise was her grandfather, Hollis Hollis, a retired pattern maker with 1 cloudy eye and 3 missing fingertips. Every Saturday before sunrise, he collected her in a green Ford truck, smelling of cedar shavings and cold coffee. They drove to his shed beside the Fox River, where he kept wooden patterns for stove doors, pulley housings, sod irons, and fluting irons whose paired ridges met like folded cloth. He showed her how to dust a sand mold with parting powder, vent it with wire, and listen to gray iron cooling. At noon, they ate egg sandwiches on an overturned flask. Fern was never allowed near a pour, but she learned to read heat by color, hear a loose handle, and file a mating surface until no daylight showed between the plates. Exact work is a form of mercy, Elias told her. He meant that a tool should not punish the hand using it. A hinge should close without pinching. An iron should press cloth without scorching the woman who had already worked all day. He died in March 2015 after a short illness. The shed was sold with the lot. His patterns went to scrap, his files vanished into an estate auction, and the nickel caliper promised to Fern was taken by an uncle who never used it. She kept only the photograph of Elias beside a cupola furnace, his good hand resting on a fluting iron mold. At 21, Fern found work at Bellwether Antique Laundry in Oak Park, where bridal lace and museum dresses arrived in acid-free boxes. The owner, Martin Vale, spoke softly enough that everyone leaned toward him. He kept the boiler room locked, altered time cards in pencil, and corrected employees by standing behind them in silence. When Fern reported a fuel smell near the pressing room, he wrote careless handling beside her name and warned her not to create insurance problems. The fire began before dawn on September 6, 2022. By breakfast, the roof had folded inward, and the steam presses stood black in the rain. Vale told the investigator Fern had left solvent near a pilot flame. It was false, but he had the keys and records. She had soot in her hair and no one willing to confirm her warning. 6 days later, the room she shared with her mother was no longer hers. The landlord set Fern's scorched satchel beside the stair rail. Lorna stood behind him, holding a blue ceramic bowl, the one Fern had repaired with brass staples. Her mother did not look up. "You have until Friday. Take only what's yours." 8 words, no raised voice. Fern reached for the bowl, but Lorna tightened both hands around it. That small motion settled the matter. Fern took the satchel, 1 sweater, Elias's photograph, and the blanket from her bed. She left the calico curtains hanging because she had sewn them for the room, not for herself. For 6 weeks, she moved west by busfoot and borrowed rides. In Cicero, she slept in a clinic waiting room until a guard began checking tickets. In Joliet, she paid $18 for a mission cot and woke to onions frying before sunrise. In DeKalb, she slept behind a laundromat vent where warm lint caught in her hair. Her money fell from $73 to $41, then $22, then $9. She washed in library restrooms, wrapped bread in napkins, and learned which stations dimmed their lights without locking their doors. By mid-October, Fern reached Geneva with $4.12, though she later remembered only the $4, because the pennies felt too small to count. She spent nothing that morning. Hunger could be carried. Fare could not. At the Geneva Public Library, she warmed her hands beneath the restroom dryer and read classifieds from 3 local papers. Most demanded deposits, references, or tools. Near the bottom of a Kane County disposal notice, one line had been circled in faded red pencil: abandoned industrial parcel, former Hollis Fluting Works, structure unsafe, tax deed transfer $4, inquire county clerk. Fern read the surname once, then pressed her thumb over it, as though testing raised type. The notice gave no photograph, only a parcel number and demolition warning. She copied both onto the back of a discarded due date slip. Outside rain combed the library windows. The county offices were 6 blocks away, and she owned exactly enough to become responsible for something everyone else had refused. Fern folded the slip into Elias's photograph and started walking. By noon, she would either own a condemned foundry or still possess $4. Fern crossed State Street beneath a rain that had thinned to silver threads, then followed South 3rd toward the county offices, with her satchel knocking against her hip. Each step made the $4 inside her coat pocket strike together, a small, hard sound that kept pace with her breathing. The clerk's office occupied the first floor of a limestone building whose brass doors had been polished around the handles by generations of hands. Fern paused beneath the awning, wiped rain from Elias's photograph with her sleeve, and entered before warmth could persuade her to remain outside without acting. A woman behind the central counter wore her gray hair in a braid no thicker than a pencil. A magnifying lens hung from a black cord against her cardigan, and the nameplate before her read, Ruth Delaney Deed Services. Fern placed the disposal notice on the counter. I came about parcel 0922-346. Mrs. Delaney read the number, then looked at Fern's wet shoes, scorched satchel, and empty hands. You understand the building has been condemned? Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no working electricity? Yes, ma'am. You understand the well has not been tested since 1989? Yes, ma'am. You understand demolition becomes your responsibility after transfer? Fern felt the coins through the lining of her pocket. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Delaney removed her glasses. Most people ask what it is worth before they agree to own it. I know what $4 is worth. For several seconds only, the radiator clicked. Then the clerk opened a ledger wide enough to cover half the counter and drew a packet from beneath it. The parcel included 9/10 of an acre, 1 industrial structure, 1 collapsed coal shed, and whatever machinery remained inside. No mineral rights. No municipal water. Taxes forgiven through transfer provided the deed was recorded that day. Fern signed her full name in 3 places. When she wrote Hollis, Mrs. Delaney's hand stopped above the brass recording stamp. Hollis, she said. Was Elias Hollis related to you? Fern looked up. He was my grandfather. The clerk leaned back slowly. The pattern maker. You knew him. I knew his work. My father repaired laundry equipment in St. Charles. Elias made a replacement roller casting for him when the manufacturer refused. Wouldn't take payment until the machine ran a full week. Fern held the pen still. Mrs. Delaney opened a narrow drawer and removed a yellowed index card. On it was typed Hollis Fluting Works with an address crossed out and rewritten twice. Below the final address, someone had penciled, E. Hollis Consulted, 1979. He came here asking who owned the place, she said. The records were tangled after the last proprietor died. He returned twice, then stopped. He never told me. Perhaps there was nothing useful to tell. Mrs. Delaney studied the photograph Fern had laid beside the papers. Her eyes moved from the man beside the furnace to the young woman at the counter. He would have disliked the county selling it for less than lunch. I disliked waste. That sounds more like him. She placed Fern's 4 $1 bills into the drawer, pressed the deed beneath the brass stamp, and pulled the handle. The mechanism descended with a deliberate clack, leaving the county seal raised in blue ink. Take Route 31 north for 1 mile, she said. Turn west on Stevens Street, then follow McKinley Avenue until the pavement narrows. At the old Creamery Foundation, use the gravel lane marked Hollow Tree Road. The Foundry is 0.8 of a mile beyond the last mailbox. Fern folded the deed into her satchel. Mrs. Delaney slid one of the 4 bills away from the others and tucked it beneath the index card. For the record, she said almost to herself. Outside the rain had stopped, but the bus north had already gone. Fern walked. Route 31 carried trucks that pushed damp air against her coat. She passed Carlson's Feed and Seed, the red awning of Graham's Pharmacy Little Owl Cafe, with its windows fogged by Soup Prentice Hardware, beneath a striped clock, and the Geneva Shoe Hospital, where a wooden boot swung above the door. Every business appeared to contain heat chairs and people who knew where they would sleep. By the time she reached Stevens Street, the satchel strap had raised a welt across her shoulder. The pavement narrowed beside dormant fields, and the afternoon turned the color of old pewter. At the Creamery Foundation, she found Hollow Tree Road, half hidden beneath wet leaves. A mailbox leaned at the entrance, its name painted over so often that only the final letters remained. An elderly man in brown coveralls stood beside it, stacking split walnut into a wheelbarrow. A black and white dog watched Fern without barking. You headed to the old iron place, the man asked. Yes. He looked at her satchel. On foot. Yes. The dog sneezed and sat down. Name's Walter Pruitt. That's June. He indicated the dog. She'll follow you to the walnuts, then come home when she decides you're not carrying sausage. June followed anyway. The lane descended between hedges and opened beside 3 walnut trees, whose bare branches crossed above the track. Beyond them stood the Foundry. It was larger than Fern had imagined, and lower than the word factory suggested a brick rectangle roughly 30 feet wide and 70 feet long, with limestone sills and a timber roof sagging toward the north wall. Rusted sheet metal patched one corner. A square chimney rose from the rear, its cap missing, while the furnace stack leaned beside it like a second, narrower tower. Above the double doors, a wooden sign retained 4 pale words beneath moss and soot. Hollis Fluting Iron Works. Fern stopped. Elias had not merely searched for the building. His name had once been part of it, or the same family name had belonged to someone long before him. The letters were too faded to answer which. June sniffed. The threshold glanced back at Fern and trotted toward home. A county padlock hung from the doors, but Mrs. Delaney had given Fern a square steel key. It resisted twice before turning. When Fern pulled, the left door moved 3 inches and caught against swollen floorboards. She set down her satchel, braced one boot against the brick, and pulled until the wood released with a sound like cloth tearing. Cold iron breathed from the darkness. The front room held a desk without drawers, 2 long benches, and a pot-bellied stove filmed with rust. Rain had entered through a roof seam and darkened the floor in the shape of a river delta. Fern tasted grit when she inhaled. Somewhere inside the wall, water tapped at regular intervals. She opened the second door for light. Beyond an interior partition lay the workroom. The air smelled of wet ash mouse nests and the mineral sharpness of old metal. Sand crunched beneath her soles. When she touched the nearest bench, a skin of black dust clung to her fingertips and felt finer than flour. At the rear, the cracked cupola furnace stood beneath the leaning stack. Its fire-brick lining had fallen inward, and a hardened tongue of slag reached from the tap hole to the floor. Around it rested wooden molding flasks, warped but recognizable, and several iron shapes half buried beneath debris. Fern lifted one. It was the upper jaw of a fluting iron, its zigzag grooves packed with rust. Even cold, it carried the dense balance Elias had taught her to notice. The handle socket had been drilled by hand. A faint maker's mark remained beneath her thumb. GFW. She held it until her palm began to ache. Dusk entered early. Fern found no lamp, but a cracked window admitted enough light to choose a dry place near the stove. She swept the floor with a broom whose bristles had been gnawed short, laid her blanket over flattened cardboard, and ate the heel of bread saved from Joliet. The bread tasted of paper and smoke. Wind moved through the broken glazing with a low whistle carrying the scent of walnut husks and wet soil. The floor pressed cold through the blanket. In the dark, a loose roof panel lifted and settled, while something small moved behind the plaster. Fern placed Elias's photograph beside her head and kept one hand on the iron jaw. The foundry had been waiting. Fern woke before daylight because the floor had changed its voice. During the night, one plank near her shoulder had begun to tick as the temperature fell, while another beneath the stove answered with a slower creak. She lay still until she could separate those sounds from mice wind and the loose roof panel. Then she rose, folded her blanket, and marked both boards with chalk from the molding bench. For 3 days, she learned the property by necessity. The well stood 30 yards behind the foundry beneath a square wooden cover. Its rope had rotted through, so she tied her laundry cord to a rusted bucket and lowered it until water struck metal 11 seconds later. She boiled every cup. The outhouse leaned toward a stand of sumac and contained a wasp nest, 2 pages of a 1956 farm catalog, and 1 sound floorboard. At night, she walked the rooms without light, memorizing where boards dipped, where nails lifted, and where the front threshold caught her heel. On the 4th morning, she returned to town. Prentice Hardware smelled of hemp rope machine oil and the coal stove burning beside the register. Narrow drawers climbed the walls, each labeled in black ink: cotter pins, sash weights, lamp wicks, file handles. The owner, Amos Prentice, had a white mustache stained yellow at one corner and a left thumb flattened by an old hammer blow. He watched Fern set 6 coins on the counter. "I need a chimney brush, stovepipe, cement lamp oil, and a bucket that won't lose its bottom." "That building on Hollow Tree Road," she nodded. Amos looked through the front window toward the gray morning. "6 coins won't carry all that. I can work. I already have help. I can clean, stack, sweep, or repair handles." He rubbed the flattened thumb against his apron. "You own the old foundry." "The county says I do. That means the county no longer does." Fern waited. Amos opened a ledger, turned to a blank page, and wrote Fern Hollis across the top. 30-day account. "No tobacco, no sweets, no borrowing for somebody else. I don't use tobacco. Most debt begins with something people don't need." He gathered her coins into one palm, then pushed them back. The chimney brush cost $3.20. A quart of lamp oil was 68 cents. Stove cement was 42 cents. A galvanized bucket with a dent near the rim was $1.10. He added 20 feet of sash cord for 35 cents and a second-hand steel file for 75 cents. From beneath the counter, he produced a green book titled Repairs for the Farm and Small Shop. The binding's gone, and somebody cut out the chapter on tractors. The rest is sound. How much? Free things don't improve when priced. Fern carried the supplies home in the dented bucket, with the brush handle balanced across her shoulder. The stove chimney entered a brick flue before joining the larger stack at the rear. Fern removed the elbow joint and found the pipe narrowed to the width of her wrist by creosote. Elias had taught her never to trust a chimney by looking upward. Trouble clung where the eye could not follow. She spread damp sacking around the stove, tied the brush to sash cord, and climbed to the roof through the rear loading door and along a ladder made from 2 planks and nailed cleats. The bricks shifted beneath her knees. She lowered the brush until it caught, pulled it up 8 inches, drove it down again, and repeated the motion without forcing the handle sideways. The first flakes fell lightly. Then a black column collapsed through the flue and struck the stove belly with a hollow rush. For 4 hours, she worked from roof and floor, alternating the brush with a length of chain wrapped in burlap. Creosote emerged in glossy scales, brown powder, and one tarry mass, hard enough to ring against the bucket. She scraped the stovepipe seam, sealed 2 pinholes with cement, and reset the elbow so its crimped end faced downward, keeping condensation inside the pipe. By late afternoon, her face was striped black, and her arms trembled when she raised them. She rolled newspaper beneath 3 dry sticks, laid split walnut above them, with air between each piece, and struck a match. The draft pulled at once. Flame moved upward instead of spilling into the room. Smoke passed through the pipe with a low, steady hum. Fern knelt close enough to feel heat gather on her cheeks, watching the cement darken around the seam. She boiled well water in the dented bucket, added half an onion, a potato Amos had placed quietly inside the repair book, and the last heel of bread torn into pieces. The meal thickened into something between soup and paste. She ate it from an enamel cup beside the stove while sleet touched the roof. That night, the room remained cold beyond the reach of the fire, but her blanket no longer stiffened at the edges. The next morning, Fern began an inventory of the workroom. She chose objects that still possessed purpose. 2 molding flasks rested beneath a canvas sheet, their dovetail corners swollen but intact. A hand-cranked blower turned half a revolution before binding. 7 zigzag pattern plates stood against the wall, each cut to a different fluting width. A ladle with a 4-foot handle hung from a ceiling hook. On the grinding bench lay a smooth file worn hollow at its center. A box contained walnut-handled blanks, gray with dust but dry inside. Beside the furnace sat a brass pyrometer dial, whose glass had cracked exactly through the number 2100. She found 11 completed fluting irons. Most were small-hand models meant to be heated over a stove. 3 had paired jaws connected by hinges. 1 carried a clamp designed to hold the fabric beyond the hot ridges so fingers need not approach the plates. Its mechanism was crude, but the intent was careful. The largest iron lay beneath the grinding bench. Fern dragged it free by the wooden handle. The lower base was nearly 2 feet long and broader than her palm, with deep rounded grooves instead of sharp zigzags. Rust covered both plates, yet the hinge moved after she soaked it in lamp oil. She struck the upper plate with the file handle. The note was clear and short. She struck the base. It answered with a lower sound that continued after the file lifted. Fern tapped along the edges. Solid iron produced the same dull note near the hinge and toe, but the center rang differently. She turned the base over and saw a line running around its underside, faint beneath scale and soot. It was not a casting seam. The corners had been ground flat after welding. She carried the iron to the front room and placed it beside a sack of furnace sand. Then she lifted the sack with both hands, judged its weight, and set it down. The iron base felt heavier, 20 pounds, perhaps more. A cedar disc had been wedged into the handle socket beneath the mounting screw. Fern removed the screw, threaded a bent nail through the opening, and worked the disc loose. Its face bore 3 shallow cuts arranged like fluting grooves. On the back, written in faded pencil, were 2 words, "Open below." She waited until morning. The foundry owned no working grinder, but beneath the bench she found a foot-powered emery wheel with its leather belt hanging slack. Fern repaired the belt with copper wire, oiled the axle, and spent 40 minutes turning the wheel until it moved without shuddering. The weld resisted. She scored it first, with the corner of a triangular file, then held the iron base against the turning stone. Orange sparks struck her coat and died. Every 5 minutes, she stopped to cool the metal with a wet cloth, unwilling to heat whatever lay inside. The cut moved slowly around the rectangular seam. After nearly 3 hours, one corner lifted. Fern inserted a cold chisel, tapped once, then again. The plate rose no more than the thickness of a coin. A smell escaped, not rot or oil, but cedar wax and old paper kept from damp. She worked around the edge until the welded plate released into her hands. Inside the hollow base lay 4 packages wrapped in waxed cloth. Fern removed them in order and placed each on the cleaned bench. The first contained Elias's nickel caliper. She recognized the shallow crescent cut in one jaw, and the letters EH scratched beneath the slide. Beside it were 3 gravers, a small ball-peen hammer, 2 pattern maker's rules, and a steel scriber fitted into a walnut handle blackened by use. The second package held raw material, thin brass stock, blued spring steel hinge pins wrapped in oiled paper, and 6 unfinished wooden grips. One grip had been turned halfway, its tool marks still sharp. The third contained drawings on linen-backed paper. Fern opened only the top sheet. It showed a fluting iron fitted with an adjustable guard and spring clamp. Measurements crowded the margins in dark brown ink. Across the bottom were the words, "Patent application not filed." The fourth package was a tin box secured with string. Fern cut no knots. She loosened them one crossing at a time. Inside lay a letter, a military medal, and money. The bills were folded into packets, bound with cotton tape. 1s, 5s, 10s, 20s, and several $100 notes, printed in older designs. Beneath them were paper rolls of coins and 2 small canvas bags. Fern counted on the workbench. She counted once before supper, again after the stove was fed, and a third time near midnight. The total remained $26,700. The coins included barber $50, mercury dimes, Indian head, cents, and silver quarters worn smooth at Washington's hair. The bills carried dates from different decades, suggesting that someone had added to the cash slowly, rather than placing it there at once. The medal was a purple heart in a hinged case. A paper strip beneath it read, "Samuel Hollis, 1944. Fern set the money apart from the tools. She touched the letter only by its edges. The envelope had yellowed, but the seal remained unbroken, on the front, in the same deliberate hand that labeled the patent drawings someone had written, "For the keeper who opens the iron." Fern carried the envelope to the stove, then stopped. The workroom felt altered by knowledge, though no object had moved. $26,700 lay inside a tin box. Elias's lost caliper rested within reach. An unknown member of her family had hidden a soldier's medal beside designs meant to protect working hands. She could not read the letter while hungry, filthy, and half awake. Fern wrapped the money again, returned it to the hollow base, and placed the heavy plate loosely over the opening. She kept the tools and envelope beside her blanket. Then she stepped through the rear door. Sleet had ended. The drainage ditch beyond the walnut trees had filled from the week's rain and moved like a narrow black creek beneath the moon. Fern sat on a limestone block and watched the water carry leaves under the fence one at a time. She remained there until the cold reached through her coat and the envelope in her pocket took on the warmth of her body. The foundry had been waiting. Morning entered through the cracked eastern window in a narrow band of white light. Fern washed her hands twice, dried them on the least soiled corner of her blanket, and placed the envelope beside Elias's caliper. She recognized the handwriting before breaking the seal. The long downward stroke of the H matched the labels on the patent drawings. The small R leaned forward, as though pressed by an impatient hand. Fern slid the steel scriber beneath the flap and opened it without tearing the paper. "My dear one, whoever you are, Dr. Nathaniel Crane of St. Joseph Hospital in Elgin told me in January that the growth in my lungs has passed the reach of surgery. He spoke plainly, which is the kindness I asked of him. I may have 6 months. I have used one of them putting these things in order. My name is Margaret Louise Hollis. My great-grandfather Josiah Hollis came from Pittsburgh to Geneva in 1858 and poured stove fittings in a shed near the river. His daughter Anne Hollis Reed returned after her husband died in 1872 and began shaping irons for dressmakers. Anne's son, William Reed Hollis, built this shop in 1889. My father, Thomas Hollis, kept it through the lean years, and I entered the work beside him in 1916, though my name was never painted over the door. The trade closed on October 18, 1948. Since that day, this building has held more than 30 years of silence. My husband, Samuel Hollis, was killed in France in 1944. While serving with the United States Army, the metal enclosed here was returned to me with his effects. We had no children. My brother's boy Elias had the hands for pattern work, but not the wish to inherit a dead shop, and I would not burden him with guilt. If he ever came searching, I hope he understood. The money was saved from repair work, property rent, and the sale of tools I could bear to part with. Use it to make the building safe before you use it to make yourself comfortable. Roof first. Chimney second. Water before paint. The drawings concern a guarded fluting iron I designed after Mrs. Klein at the dress shop burned 3 fingers in 1931. The lower plate should be gray iron poured at 2. Mix 1 part sea coal to 12, facing sand where the grooves must remain clean. Let the casting cool in the mold for no less than 14 hours. File the mating faces together, never separately, and leave 1/32 of an inch at the cloth entrance so the fabric feeds without biting. For the walnut handles, turn with the grain and soak the finished pieces in warm linseed oil for 20 minutes. The spring clamp must hold firmly at 3 pounds of pressure and release with 1 hand. A tool is not honest if it asks the worker to suffer for its beauty. These patents were never filed. War took Samuel's sickness, took my father, and time took the market. Perhaps that is fitting. Inheritance is not a claim made by blood alone. It is the willingness to continue careful work after the person who taught it is gone. Behind the foundry, 12 paces from the back door, stands a limestone marker beneath the western walnut. Samuel set it when his brother left for war. If the tree remains, you will find our mark cut into the stone. Keep what is useful. Sell what must be sold. Do not preserve ruin merely because it is old. But if you restore this place, let it serve tired hands. These irons were small machines, yet they helped women walk into church court work and mourning with their collars straight when the rest of life had come apart. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Margaret Louise Hollis, March 4, 1981. Fern read the letter a second time while the stove cooled. On the first reading, she had followed the names and dates. On the second, she noticed where Margaret's pen had paused after Elias leaving a small pool of ink. Fern placed the pages on the bench, aligned their edges, and folded them along the original creases until the letter fit the envelope exactly as it had before. She put on her coat and went through the back door. 12 paces carried her past the drainage ditch and beneath the western walnut, where roots had lifted the soil into hard ridges. Fallen leaves covered the ground. Fern cleared them with both hands until her nails filled with black earth. The marker lay flat beneath the roots, not upright as she had imagined. It was a limestone rectangle the size of a breadboard, softened at the corners by weather. 3 parallel grooves had been carved across its face. Beneath them were the initials SH and a date nearly erased by lichen. Fern pressed her palm to the stone. The tree had grown around one edge without moving it. Samuel had placed the marker before leaving. Margaret had written of it 37 years later, and Elias had visited the county without telling Fern why. Their choices had not formed a straight line. They had waited in separate objects until someone gathered them. Back inside, Fern opened the first waxed package and selected the small brass alcohol lamp that had rested beneath the tools. Its wick had hardened, but Amos's free manual described how to draw a new strip of cotton through the burner with wire. She trimmed the wick, filled the reservoir with lamp alcohol from an old sealed bottle in the cabinet, and struck a match. A blue flame rose no taller than her thumbnail. Fern set the lamp beneath the smallest fluting iron. Heat traveled slowly into the grooves, loosening the smell of wax and old cloth from the metal. She did not press anything. She only watched the tool warm on the bench where Margaret might once have tested it. By noon, small kindnesses had begun to arrange themselves in her mind. Mrs. Delaney had kept one of Fern's dollar bills beneath the Hollis index card, instead of dropping it into the county drawer. Walter Pruitt had pointed out the safe bend in Hollow Tree Road and sent June beside her without calling it help. Amos Prentice had opened credit to a woman with no address and hidden a potato inside a repair book. At the Joliet Mission, a cook named Bernice had wrapped an extra piece of cornbread in waxed paper while pretending not to see Fern place it in her pocket. None of them had repaired her life. Each had merely lifted one corner long enough for her to put her hand beneath it. Before we move on, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to. Perhaps it was a meal, a ride, a patient answer, or a door held open at the right moment. Tell us about it in the comments. Small mercies are often remembered longer than grand promises. That evening, Fern returned the money to the tin box, but kept Margaret's letter, Samuel's medal, and Elias's tools beside her blanket. She wrapped the caliper in her sweater and placed the purple heart inside one of her shoes so it could not be disturbed in the night. The blue lamp burned until the room smelled faintly of warm brass. The first snow came on December 2nd and measured 4 inches against the foundry's north wall. It entered through the roof seam in pale, sifted lines, dusting the furnace bricks and the bench where Margaret's drawings lay beneath oilcloth. Fern read the roofing chapter in Amos's repair manual 3 times before climbing the ladder. The roof measured 32 by 72 feet, with enough sound decking left to save beneath the eastern slope. Her figures called for 26 squares of asphalt shingles, 6 rolls of felt, and nearly 40 pounds of galvanized roofing nails after allowing for waste along the broken eaves. She bought only what the cash could justify and wrote every expense in the back of the manual. Amos delivered the first bundles in his truck. Before leaving, he placed a roofing hatchet on the tailgate. Its head was narrow, its gauge worn smooth. My brother used that until his knees quit. I will bring it back. I is dead. The hatchet isn't. The man who arrived the next morning was Walter Pruitt's older cousin Silas, a former roofer with red suspenders and a scar running from his ear into his collar. He climbed halfway up the ladder, inspected the sag, and came down without speaking. Fern offered him payment. Silas shook his head. You can't afford my mistakes. For 11 days, they worked beneath a sky the color of zinc. Fern sistered the split rafter with a new board, bolted through the soundwood, then snapped a chalk line across the felt, so each course would remain honest. Silas taught her to set nails with 3 strokes, 1 to place, 1 to drive, 1 to seat. On the 4th morning, he touched a nail head with his hatchet. That nail's proud. Fern raised the hammer. Pull it. She did. By the 9th day, her palms had opened beneath both thumbs. She wrapped them in cloth and kept working. Snowmelt ran down the old shingles, froze along the scaffold, and turned every descent into a deliberate act. They finished on December 14. Silas drove the final ridge nail, handed Fern the hatchet, and climbed down. That night, rain crossed Kane County. Fern remained awake until dawn, listening. Nothing fell inside. January exposed what warmth had hidden. When Fern built a stronger fire, flakes of brick loosened from the chimney's inner face and fell behind the stove. Outside, several courses had begun to spall, their surfaces peeling in thin red shells. Mortar crumbled beneath her finger into powder. Amos sold her hydraulic lime and fireclay on credit. For the firebox joints, she mixed 1 part fireclay with 2 parts screened sand and enough water to make the mortar hold a thumbprint without slumping. For the exterior courses, she used 1 part hydraulic lime to 3 parts sharp sand, resisting the temptation to make it wetter when the wind dried the surface. She removed only 6 bricks at a time. For 3 weeks, temperatures remained in the 20s. Fern warmed each replacement brick near the stove, brushed the bed joint clean, dampened it lightly, and pressed mortar into the void with a narrow pointing trowel. Every 15 minutes, her bare hands went numb. Gloves protected her skin, but stole the exact pressure needed to butter the joints, so she worked until her fingers stopped obeying, then held them around a cup of hot water. Silas came once, looked up the stack, and said, "Do not chase straight, chase sound." She left the old lean where correcting it would have disturbed stable masonry. By January 27, the crown had been capped, the flue joints packed, and the stove connection resealed. Fern lit a test fire with 1 sheet of newspaper and 3 lengths of dry walnut. The smoke rose cleanly. Outside, it left the chimney in a narrow gray ribbon that did not curl back toward the roof. Fern stood in the yard until the fire reached full draw, watching the repaired masonry remain still. Beneath the soot, the front room floor was white pine fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails whose dark square faces sat unevenly above the grain. Fern drove each loose nail below the surface with a punch, then replaced 2 rotten boards using planks salvaged from the collapsed coal shed. A rental yard in St. Charles charged $14 per day for a random orbit sander. Fern carried it home in Walter's wheelbarrow because the truck would not start in the cold. She began with 80 grit paper, guiding the machine slowly enough to remove grime without carving hollows around the old nail heads. The second pass at 120 grit revealed saw marks and pale knots. The final pass at 220 left the boards smooth but not new. She kept the dents made by dropped tools and 1 black crescent, where a hot iron had scorched the pine generations earlier. Dust settled everywhere. It entered her cuffs, coated her eyelashes, and turned the water in the wash bucket gray. Fern wiped the floor with mineral spirits, waited overnight, then rubbed in the first coat of boiled linseed oil by hand. 2 more coats followed, each thin enough to sink rather than skin over. She left 48 hours for the final cure and slept in the workroom, while the front room darkened from honey toward mahogany. One morning she woke unable to lift the sanding block. The sky was clear, the tools were ready, and nothing in the room had changed. Still, she put on her coat and walked to the marsh beyond the road. A great blue heron stood among the reeds, 1 leg folded beneath its body, waiting above water the color of lead. Fern sat on a fallen log until afternoon. She did no work that day. When she returned, the floor had absorbed the oil evenly. Her footprints stopped at the threshold. There were 8 windows in the foundry. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held cracked panes repaired with taped tin or folded cardboard. The last contained 1 original sheet whose ripples bent the walnut branches when Fern looked through it. Amos claimed the glass dated from 1788, reused from an earlier house before the foundry was built. Fern preserved it exactly where it was. For the missing panes, she scraped each rabbit clean, brushed on linseed oil, and bedded the glass in a thin rope of Day P33 glazing putty. She pressed glazier's points every 8 inches, then drew the putty knife along the exterior bevel in 1 steady pass, keeping the inside line narrow enough that no putty showed beyond the muntin. The sash cords had rotted to brown fibers. Fern replaced them with 1/4-inch cotton cord, lowering the counterweights inside the pockets and tying each end with a figure-8 knot large enough to hold without crushing the fibers. The first sash dropped hard because she had crossed the cords. She removed it, corrected the mistake, and began again. By the seventh window, she could judge the weight by the sound of the pulley. On the final afternoon, Fern fitted the last repaired sash into the western opening. As she lifted it, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside no farther than the length of her arm. The bird tilted its black-capped head while Fern tied the cord. She lowered the sash. It stopped halfway balanced between its two counterweights and remained there without trembling. The chickadee stayed until the putty knife made its final clean line. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Fern completed her first fluting iron. She had practiced on 13 castings no larger than a hand, each paid for with a single silver quarter from Margaret's cash. The failures remained on a shelf, one warped at the hinge, one pitted where the sand had carried too much moisture, one filed so tightly that cloth could not pass between the grooves. For the finished iron, she rammed the mold in 2 flasks, mixed sea coal into the facing sand at Margaret's ratio, and poured gray iron at 150 degrees. She left the casting buried for 14 hours, though impatience woke her twice before dawn. When the metal had cooled, Fern filed the mating faces together, stopping only when a strip of cotton passed through the 1/32 entrance without snagging. The walnut handles had soaked in warm linseed oil. The spring guard released beneath one hand. Fern heated the plates over the brass alcohol lamp, laid a damp length of muslin across the lower grooves, and closed the iron. When she lifted it, the cloth carried 7 exact flutes. The restored front room had become both kitchen and receiving space. The pine floor held its dark warmth beneath braided rugs. Margaret's patent drawings hung behind glass over the desk. The original wavy pane remained in the western window, bending winter branches, as it had before Fern arrived. In the workroom, the repaired blower turned freely, the furnace wore new fire brick, and Elias's caliper rested in a fitted walnut case beside the files. The brass key had stayed on the mantel through both winters. Fern tested it in cabinets, desk locks, tool chests, and the old plate beneath the furnace damper. It fit nothing. She had stopped searching when the answer revealed itself during the pruning of the western walnut. A storm had split a dead limb. As Fern cut it away, the bark beneath the fork loosened in a single plate, exposing a small brass escutcheon set directly into the trunk. Growth had nearly closed around it. At its center waited a keyhole shaped like 3 narrow grooves. The brass key turned once. A rectangular section of wood released from the trunk, not deeply enough to harm the living heartwood, but wide enough to hide a zinc-lined compartment. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag wrapped in oilcloth and a note dated December 18, 1944. The handwriting belonged to Anne Hollis Mercer, Margaret's mother. She wrote during the Battle of the Bulge, after news reached Geneva, that Samuel's unit had entered France, and before the family learned, he would not return. The flag had flown above the Foundry on the morning he enlisted. Anne had hidden it in the walnut, because iron could be searched, buildings could be sold, and trees were often left alone. Her note contained no prophecy. It asked only that the flag be unfolded when someone once again made an honest tool in the shop. Fern carried it inside. She cleared the workbench, washed her hands, and opened the flag without allowing it to touch the floor. The blue field held 48 stars in straight rows. Along one white striped soot had left the faint outline of a thumb. On June 6, the following summer, Fern brought Samuel's Purple Heart to Oak Hill Cemetery in Geneva. His body had remained overseas, but his name appeared on a family stone beside Margaret's. Fern placed the metal case against the granite on the anniversary of the Normandy landings and remained until the morning rains stopped. She did not leave the metal there. It belonged with the drawings, the flag, and the unfinished handle where work rather than weather could guard it. Of the money sealed beneath the fluting iron base, Fern spent only 4 coins. 3 paid for small quantities of brass spring steel and Foundry sand while she practiced. The 4th, a Barber $50 worn smooth along Liberty's crown, purchased an old wooden stamp box at an estate sale. The bills remained wrapped in cotton tape. Fern returned them to the tin container with a ledger of every repair, every borrowed tool, and every person who had helped without asking what the property might someday be worth. She resealed the chamber beneath the iron base, but not with a permanent weld. 4 machine screws held the plate in place. Across the inside she scratched, for the next one. Open carefully. The shop reopened without announcement. Fern wrote on a plain index card, Hollis Fluting Iron Works repairs, small castings, and textile pressing tools inquire by mail. Doris pinned it to the corkboard at Little Owl Cafe between a notice for piano lessons and a lost orange cat. The first request came from a historical society in Iowa whose fluting iron would no longer close. The second came from a theater wardrobe room in Milwaukee. By autumn, Fern kept a mailing list of 43 names in a ruled school notebook. She accepted only the work she could finish carefully. Caleb returned one April morning taller than Fern remembered, though he still rode the same Schwinn. A long object was tied across the handlebars with clothesline. He had carved a sign from black walnut. The old shop name ran across the upper board in deep, patient letters. Beneath it, on a narrow piece joined with wooden pegs, Caleb had added 2 words, and daughters. Fern traced the final S. There were no daughters on the sign, she said. There were in the shop. He declined payment, but accepted a sharpening lesson. They spent the afternoon flattening the back of a chisel on oilstone until it reflected the windows. The sign went above the double doors. Inside Fern began a letter of her own. She used heavy paper, a fountain pen from Prentice Hardware, and the desk, whose drawers she had rebuilt from salvaged pine. My dear one, whoever you are. She described no hidden fortune. She wrote about the north rafter, the crooked chimney, the original window, and the day. The first casting failed because the mold had been rammed too hard. She listed the names of those who had brought food tools, labor, and quiet company. She explained where the repair ledger was kept and how to tell by sound when the larger iron base was hollow. Inheritance, Fern wrote, was not proof that a person deserved what had been saved. It was an invitation to become careful enough to keep something useful. She folded the pages along exact creases and placed them inside a new envelope. By then, the walnut trees had leafed out beyond the western glass. The chickadees nested in a fence post and water moved beneath Hollow Tree Road after the spring rain. Fern opened the foundry doors and let the mild air pass through both rooms. The foundry had been waiting. Now the furnace gave off the mineral warmth of yesterday's pour, and the new sign moved slightly above the doors. A finished iron cooled on the bench while an unfinished one waited beside it. The Fluting Iron Foundry waits. It has always waited. At the Kane County Clerk's office, Ruth Delaney retired with little ceremony. Her successor emptied 2 drawers, replaced the blotter, and left the old Hollis index card where it lay. Beneath it remained 1 worn dollar bill separated from the county's money and folded once through the middle. No one spent it.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.